BBC Home Service. Musicians in Focus. During the interval, Alvin Langdon Coburn recalls some of the famous musical figures who sat for him during his career as a photographer.
Perhaps one of the greatest satisfactions in life is to be able to accomplish work that you really enjoy. I began making photographs in the year 1890, when I was only 8 years of age, and I still make photographs and have never lost the thrill of the experience. Of course, in the very early days, it was just a schoolboy pastime. But in 1904, I began to take photography seriously. And one of my first famous sitters was Bernard Shaw, himself a photographer of considerable enthusiasm, but not of outstanding skill. And I really believe he was more proud of his photographs than of his masterly plays. He was good enough to be interested in my work with the camera, and he wrote a preface to my one-man show at the Royal Photographic Society in 1906, a great help to me at that time. I always endeavored to photograph the people I was desirous of meeting, whose work I admired, and at the beginning of the century it was mostly writers and painters that I wanted to capture. In the year 1913, I published my first book of portraits, Men of Mark, now long out of print and a collector's item. And in it were such interesting people as Shaw, Wells, Chesterton, Frank Brangwyn, with whom I studied painting, Meredith, Rodin, Henry James, Mark Twain, Robert Bridges, and Matisse. Some of these people subsequently became my friends and added greatly to the fullness and interest of my life. It was in 1914, just before the beginning of World War I, that I began photographing musicians. I was very interested in music, especially in connection with the pianola. I had over 1,000 rolls and played the solo part in a piano concerto with a symphony orchestra and the piano part in a violin and piano sonatas with many talented violinists. I have even cut rolls for myself with a perforator, which I had made for me, so that I might produce music not then obtainable. I have a theory that even as the art of photography is to that of the painter, so is the art of the pianola to that of the pianist. I feel that the mechanical rendering in both cases frees the soul of the artist from certain technical limitations, so that he is able to devote himself to the sheer joy of an untrammeled rendering. In those days, my wife and I oft went to promenade concerts, and so it was very fitting that the first photograph of a musician that I made should be that of Sir Henry Wood, who was good enough to give me a sitting. Sir Henry was a typical famous conductor, with his piercing eyes, well-trimmed beard, and with a fur collar to his overcoat. He was undoubtedly a personality, able to dominate and inspire his orchestra and his audience, and yet with it all, he was a very kindly and human person. He seemed to enjoy being photographed, and although he must often have stood before a camera, yet he was not bored with the process, but chatted affably with me, even making me feel that I was conferring a favor upon him in adding him to my collection of famous people. It was at one of Sir Henry Wood's concerts that I first heard the playing of that unique pianist Bachmann, and was thrilled by his genius. The evening before a sitting had been arranged for me to photograph Bachmann, I went to a recital he was giving at the old Queen's Hall, near what is now Broadcasting House, and I sat on the platform to be as near him as possible, so that I could study him at close range. And I noticed that as he played, he kept looking at me and smiling and nodding his head. When I arrived at his studio the next morning, to my amazement, he rushed up to me and embraced me, saying, "I played to you last night." Of course he was famous for his Chopin, but I, with great daring, but truthfully, told him that I preferred his Bach. This pleased him enormously, and he at once said, "You like my Bach? I play you some Bach." And he sat down at the piano forthwith and gave me a recital of this great composer. How wonderful it is to be able to come into intimate personal touch with the great ones of one's admiration. What else but photography could have made such a thing possible? How else could I have been able to have a great pianist give me a personal recital in this intimate and delightful way? Parkman was even as a child in his joy of life. And I believe that most great artists have this simple, childlike gladness in their hearts. They do not grow up and become disillusioned and world-weary, as do most ordinary people. But Parkman had this quality in an especially pleasing degree. When I took him some photographs at a later date and asked him to sign one for me, he informed me that he would rather play a sonata than write his name. But he nevertheless complied with my request in what seemed to be quite the handwriting of a schoolboy, which only goes to prove that we each have our special skills as well as our limitations. My next adventure was to photograph Shaliapin, for which I prepared by seeing him in most of his roles in the Russian opera season, then in full swing in London. He was a difficult lion to capture, but when I finally succeeded in reaching his presence, it seemed as if he had all the time in the world to place at my disposal. He was great in every possible way, both as an actor as well as a musician. Over 6 feet in stature, with a presence that came to meet you with a tremendous impact, yet with it all he was calm and serene, as if there was within him a vast reserve of power. Shaliapin had a little English and I had a little French, and so we managed to get on famously. I made a large number of negatives of him, and when later I took the results to him for his acceptance, he was so pleased with them that he suggested that I should make more photographs of him in his various characters in the Russian operas in London that fateful summer of 1914. But war was then suddenly declared, and so to my great regret, this never happened. I have, however, a much treasured souvenir of our meetings in a signed print inscribed in his strong and characteristic handwriting, "Bravo et merci." The print I chose for him to sign was a profile with the light gleaming on his golden hair, in a silk shirt with a flowing black tie, such as were worn by the French artists of that period. This photograph is, as was the man, virile and dynamic. The whole episode was unforgettable and very satisfying. Another of my early captures was Mark Hamburg, who introduced me to the great violinist Ysaÿe, and as a result of this contact, my wife and I were invited to a party at the Hamburg's house, where these two, with Cedric Sharp, the cellist, played wonderfully together. Hamburg at home was a very different person from Hamburg on the concert platform. On the latter, he delighted to dazzle his audience with his virtuosity, but at home he was quiet and restrained, both in his music and as a perfect host. When talented musicians play together for their own delectation, something rarely beautiful is achieved, as they blend their skill and inspiration in perfect harmony. They completely forget themselves in their music, and the result is never to be forgotten, and exemplifies the truth that perfection in any art is achieved by a total self-forgetting on the part of the artist. I will never forget photographing Sir Thomas Beecham in a room lined with little cupboards containing innumerable cigars, one of which he hospitably offered me when I had made my photographs, and he seemed greatly disappointed when I said that I did not smoke, assuring me that I missed one of the supreme pleasures of life by abstaining. I was at about this time greatly privileged to photograph Sibelius. Sir Granville Bantock got him to sit for me, for they were great friends and admirers of each other's music. Sibelius had one of the most powerful heads I have ever photographed. It was square and reminded me of a bust by Rodin. For so great a man, he was very shy, and in theory it was said that he disliked being photographed. But as Bantock came along to the sitting after we three had lunched together, it all worked out very satisfactorily, for as they chatted, I got on with my work. I think I made a worthy portrait of him. He was very akin to his music, reserved but with great spiritual power, living within himself, yet sharing his dreams with us, to our great refreshment. Not long after this, in 1919, I photographed Delius, whose music was only just beginning to be recognized. I met him through Cyril Scott, as they were friends. What do I remember of Delius after the passing of over 40 years? The delicacy of his hands, true pianist's hands with their long tapering fingers, and that strange otherworldly look in his face, as if even in your presence a new and very mysterious kind of music was forming itself in his mind. Whenever I hear this delightful music of his, and we hear it more often these days, I am glad to say, I think of that day when I met and photographed him, and I rejoice in retrospect in the experience. The last of my portraits of musicians was Stravinsky, of whom I was and am a great admirer. I photographed him in the middle of the morning in his dressing gown, but there was nothing sleepy or relaxed about him. He was as alive and forceful as anyone I have ever photographed, and this is exemplified by the variety, vitality, and scope of his music. My best portrait of him seems to be looking at you, taking your measure, and as it were, ready to plow down upon you and overwhelm you, even as the figurehead on the prow of a great ship as it cleaves the waves. This is the effect that his music often has upon you. It cannot be heard with indifference, nor can Stravinsky himself be met and known with indifference. And so I come to the end of my tale. Many of these photographs of musicians, and there are 33 of them, have never been published. But I enjoy going through them in their portfolio, for they remind me of those wonderful days when music was so happily woven into the pattern of my life. As we grow older, and we hope a little wiser, it is good, very good, to look back on the past and to remember those we have met, and especially those who have added beauty and joy to the world by the exercise of their art.
That talk by Alvin Langdon Coburn was recorded.